Wow, it just got quiet so easily. So good evening, everyone. Can you hear? There, okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of Union Theological Seminary, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Spirit of Justice conversation between Michelle Alexander and Patrisse Cullors. I'm the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. And I'm very happy to, right off the bat, introduce to you the Canon Reverend Dr. Professor Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, my friend here. And she is the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary.
Thank you, and it's always, of course, a joy and a privilege to be here with President Jones, my friend and colleague. And good evening to all of you. I am pleased, of course, to be here tonight, as I'm sure you all are, looking forward to hearing these two powerful advocates discuss the complex realities of injustice in our country today, as well as leading us in thinking about the pathway toward a more just society. Union has long been a place that nurtures leaders in the struggle for justice, like Patrisse Cullors. It's a place where faith and scholarship meet to reimagine not only the work of justice and tackling the complex issues of race, gender, sexual, and economic oppression, but also helping us to reimagine what a just society looks like.
So tonight's guest, Patrisse Cullors, is best known as the co-founder of Black Lives Matters, but she's been an advocate and an organizer for a very long time. She's an artist and a freedom fighter, as she describes herself, from Los Angeles, who has received numerous awards for her activism and her movement building. She has worked tirelessly promoting law enforcement accountability and addressing directly trauma in communities affected by poverty, incarceration, the many-legged effects of racism and violence. After developing her first performance art piece, addressing the violence of incarceration, Patrisse founded a nonprofit called Dignity and Power Now that pushed for and led to the formation of, this is remarkable, Los Angeles's first civilian oversight commission in the LA Sheriff's Department. She's a Fulbright scholar. She received a degree, I love this, in religion and philosophy in 2012 from UCLA. Her new book, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter's memoir, was an instant New York Times bestseller and a piercing piece of writing. Also this year, Patrisse has teamed up with a media company to produce a docuseries about her ongoing grassroots effort to stop, and this is incredible, a $3.5 billion jail expansion plan in Los Angeles. As you can see in all these ways, Patrisse is committed to fighting the many-legged monster of injustice wherever it appears.
Leading our conversation this evening with Patrisse Cullors will be my colleague and another leading and prophetic voice in the fight for social justice, Michelle Alexander. Michelle is a visiting professor here at Union, and as you all know, she is an acclaimed civil rights lawyer and has long been passionate for the rights of those who are oppressed, and particularly the incarcerated. And so she is the author of the best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She, of course, as I've said, is particularly concerned for the rights of the incarcerated and the disenfranchised. I fully expect tonight's conversation with Patrisse Cullors and Michelle Alexander to be challenging and inspiring for all of us. For those of you who are joining us via social media, and even for those of you here in the audience, we ask that you use your social media to join in on the conversation through Twitter and Facebook using the hashtag Spirit of Justice. And please share that tonight's conversation is in fact being live streamed, and the entire event will be posted to the Union YouTube channel later.
As have been our previous conversations with Naomi Klein and Angela Davis. So now, without further delay, please welcome Michelle Alexander and Patrisse Cullors.
Thank you for the wonderful introductions, and I am just so thrilled to be here with you tonight, Patrice. I first heard you on the radio probably a couple of years ago or more now, and I was with a friend, listened to the radio, and your voice came on, and you were so fierce and clear and courageous, and yet at the same time, so compassionate. And I thought, who is this woman? Who is this? And my friend said, oh, you know, that's Patrisse Cullors. And I'm like, I need to meet her. And so here we are meeting for the first time tonight, and I just couldn't be more thrilled to kind of introduce you to the Union community here. I also want to acknowledge the co-author of your new book, Asha Bandale. Can you stand, Asha? Yes. Asha is a friend of mine, and she's also a fantastic activist and organizer in her own right at the Drug Policy Alliance, and she's the author of a number of wonderful books, including The Prisoner's Wife and Daughter and Something Like Beautiful. The two of you were able to come together in such a beautiful way to tell your story. There's so much I want to talk with you about tonight. It's difficult to know where to begin, but nearly all of the themes are woven into the powerful memoir you wrote. I think I want to begin, though, by noting a few of the things that aren't in the book. You know, I remember actually getting an early draft, an early manuscript. In fact, I think the book was only about half done. And Asha sent it to me, and I was so moved by not only your story and how compelling it was, but by the way it was told. It was written with so much love for your family, for your community, for the people who raised you up, that I immediately said, yes, of course, I'll give you a blurb, and sent it right out. And then when I read the rest of the book, I was surprised that there was relatively little in the book about the movement itself. I guess I expected it to be a book that was partly a political manifesto, a book that perhaps described your own political philosophy or explored the tensions and conflicts and contradictions that exist within the movement itself. I thought there might be kind of lessons that have been learned in the movement and what we should be thinking about in terms of organizing in the future. And instead, it was nearly entirely a memoir that tells the story, your story, of coming of age in a community that is under siege, and what that meant for you and those who you lived and struggled with. And so I'm curious about that choice. First, why did you choose to write a memoir, and why is it centered almost entirely kind of on your personal journey, which is so compelling?
I'm still in awe that I'm here with you. I've followed your work for a long time. I just have to say, for me, The New Jim Crow was the first book where I felt like there was someone actually telling the truth about what I lived through and what my family lived through. And while it wasn't a personal telling, it was deeply personal, and it took a lot of work for me to get through it. As I cried, as I wept, I was like, finally someone saying, what our families suffered through and how decimating it was, how destructive it was. So I'm just very honored and grateful for you.
Thank you.
And hey, everybody out there. It's always strange when there's an audience. I feel like we should be in a circle and doing ritual together and processing. That's how I roll. They have many microphones hooked up to us. Let me just, okay. So it became really important, I think, by the year 2016 to write some stuff down. And before that, while I was approached to write a book, I didn't think it was necessary. I was like, I'm in the field, y'all. Those other people write books, I'm cool. And then the presidential elections happened. And then Black Lives Matter got called a terrorist organization. And then the reality of police repression and the political sense became very clear. And I was talking to a good friend of mine, and I was trying to get counsel, should I write this book? Because writing a book is a big deal, and especially being a visible movement leader, I had a lot of contradictory feelings about writing a book. My friend was like, yes, do it, and call Asha. She'll tell you how you can make this happen. So I called Asha, and I was kind of nervous, and I was like, Asha, I got something to ask you. I've been asked to write a book, what you think? And I didn't even finish the sentence. She was like, it's done, I got you, let's go. And she was so serious. She got us on a schedule. I mean, I am so grateful to Asha and the years of work, both as an author, but as an organizer and a political theorist, that she really drove this process. And I had just had my child. I remember talking to you, actually, Michelle. I was like, so you've written a book before. How long does it take? And she's like, well, it took me a lot of years to write this book. And I was like, oh, I don't have a lot of years. So. But then it was clear to me from the very beginning, I did not want to write a polemic. And that, in fact, I grew up in the middle of the war on drugs. And I wanted to tell that story. And I wanted to talk about women. We know so much about the men and their perspective. We follow the men who've been crushed by mass incarceration, by state violence. But there's those of us who are often women, are femme-identified, who end up being left to deal with the decimation of our family members and our community. And we're left to clean it up. And I wanted to tell that story. And I wanted to bring people into my life very intimately. I believe in vulnerability, and I believe in the power of Black vulnerability. That's based off of our own timeline. We're often vulnerable as Black people, and it's not based on our timeline. And so I think there's power in us having agency and when we get to be vulnerable. And so I really wanted people to feel the impact to see the impact, to smell the impact, to taste the impact. And Asha and I were very deliberate in the storytelling and the timeline. The first iteration actually started with the birth of BLM. And we got lots of feedback that, like, I think we got to start somewhere else. And Asha was like, let's start with baby Patrice. And I was like, oof, really?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did. And I think we can easily get lost in the data, in the statistics, in the theory, and the politics. And unless our conversations are grounded in some meaningful way in the lived experience of people who grew up, you know, in ground zero, then we're not actually going to be able to build the kind of movement that has any meaningful potential for transformation. And so the way the story is told is very powerful. It's a story of love and loss and hope and devastation. It's a coming of age story. It's a story about love and sexuality. And it's also a very political story, you know, in its own way. I'm curious about one other thing that wasn't really centered in the book. You know, you went and got a theology degree. You're an ordained minister. And you chose to embrace a non-Christian faith tradition, though you were raised in a church. And this is mentioned in the book. But I suspect in the reading that your faith or your spirituality, however you define it, may be more central than was revealed in the book. And so I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about your own spirituality. I think at one point you described it as your journey to understand God. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about kind of your spiritual journey, how it began and where you find yourself now, and how it informs all of your activism and your commitment to movements for liberation.
Yes. How many people in the audience grew up Jehovah's Witness? Nobody.
Wow.
I'm actually surprised. I got to call the witnesses in this area and let them know. So I grew up Jehovah's Witness, which is a very intense religion. And I'm very passionate about whatever I do. So I was a passionate Jehovah's Witness child. Did all the door-to-door knocking, and I don't knock the faith. I got a lot of family in the faith, and they are very dedicated to it, and it's their own spiritual rejuvenation. But it was very clear early on, probably around 9 or 10, when I started asking more questions. I was a very curious child, and in some Black families, you know, curiosity is not that interesting to adults when you're a child. So I remember asking a significant amount of questions one afternoon, and as each answer came to me, I was even more confused. And so by the end of my questioning of one of the adults, they looked at me and said, the devil is inside of you. You're asking too many questions. When you start to ask too many questions, the devil's inside of you. And there was something in me, even as a child, that was like, that ain't right. That don't feel right for me. So by 11 or 12, my great-grandmother gratefully was raised by her while my mom worked a lot. While she was Christian, she was also deeply spiritual. And so I talked to her a lot about spirit and God, and I felt much more aligned with her on sort of how she understood spirituality. But I knew, and I feel like you just know these things as a child. Like I knew that I wanted to do some earth-based tradition. I knew that I was like deeply connected to, I was like the weird kid that sat and prayed by the trees, and you know, I was an environmentalist before anything else, and happened upon my tradition, which is called Ifa, a Yoruba tradition. That is a tradition of a lot of Black folks and Latino folks in particular across the Americas. But I found that tradition because this is how God works sometimes. I was in a car one day, and I was talking to someone, and my roommate at the time was having a lot of terrible dreams. She was having nightmares, and I thought it was, she had tried everything, and I was like, this is spiritual, so I was like, I'm gonna go find her some support. This is very Patrice. Something happens and I build a campaign around it. And so I'm gonna go find her some support. So I'm asking people, do you know? And I knew it was gonna come from Christianity. I was like, this has to, somewhere else. So I'm talking to a friend of mine who just got back from Cuba, and I was like, do you know anybody that does readings? And he's like, oh yeah, there's a guy right down the street that does. And I was like, what? Like down the street? And he's like, yeah, I'll give him your number. And so that's how I happened upon Ifa. I got my first divination, and it changed my world. It really changed how I understood my own faith and my own tradition and my own journey. And it's a really intimate, I don't necessarily, it's not private, I'm not private about it, but it's like a really intimate part of my life that I don't often talk about. And I was glad that we shared snippets of it in the book.
Mm-hmm. So how did it change? How did it change your way of seeing the world or relating to it?
It gave, I think for me, wanting to have something tied back to the African continent was really important. Mm-hmm. And wanting to have a tradition that deeply believes that we are our own makers. There isn't some God in the sky that's dictating our world, that we are God. Mm-hmm. And it was a tradition that allowed me to be all the weird parts of me, and gave me a lot of space to explore in ways that I didn't feel like I had that space growing up as Jehovah's Witness. And it's interesting because at the same time, I started to really delve into Buddhism. And so I have a sitting practice that I do as well. And that I could be in a faith like Ifa and also have another tradition that I utilize. It was also really important to me because in the Kingdom Hall, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's what you are. You don't do other things. And so I needed to know that I could be in a tradition that allowed me to be the explorer that I am.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you think your faith or your spiritual practice relates to your activism? Do you see them in relationship to one another? Or?
Yes, they're deeply, deeply connected. And the fathers, we have a praying practice, and we have a divination practice. And I utilize both of those practices to make decisions about how I relate to myself in relationship to our movement, how I relate to our movement. I think every single time, and we may get to this about my brother, but every time my brother, who feels, it's so interesting because my brother is sort of like the intersections of the movement, my spiritual work, my beliefs around healing justice, but I am always doing very particular prayers and work for him and his well-being, and I extend that to Black folks who've experienced it. And I think if you're Black in America, you've experienced a significant amount of trauma, whether it's firsthand or secondary trauma. And so I center my work around my spiritual practice around healing those that are most marginalized by this country and this state.
Yeah. It's been my experience that a lot of young organizers and activists today are very spiritual in their own ways, and often movement spaces involve prayers and blessings, and even though it's not traditionally religious, doesn't fall with any kind of formal faith tradition. Has that been your experience?
Yes, it's so interesting because USC School of Theology has actually done like a little study of my local organization because we bring in spirituality that's different than religion. We always open up our space with some sort of spiritual practice. For me, healing justice work is spiritual work, and we've talked about it as such. And there's some of the most powerful images out of Black Lives Matter protests or events have been people saging each other, cops, you know, everything. And it's been pretty significant to witness the ways in which spirituality has shaped this iteration of the movement.
And there have been some kind of pastors and you know, particular examples, I think, of faith leaders and churches playing a meaningful role in
so
the movement.
important.
You describe in Ferguson. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
And, Reverend Starsky, I missed him the other day in Chicago. Well, it's funny because, you know, quick story, when we went to Ferguson, we brought 600 Black folks 10 days after Mike Brown's murder, and we thought we had a place to stay. And 2 days before, as I was calling that place, eventually someone picked up and was like, I don't know what you're talking about. We're closed that weekend. And I was like, what? 600 people are about to come. And so we did this huge call out. And mind you, I'm not from Ferguson or St. Louis, but Shiraz Gorman, who I talk about in the book, she actually does this email, like, 600 Black people are about to come, and we need to have them somewhere. And I got a call back from Reverend Starsky Wilson, who it was so profound, and this is like divine to me. And he says, yeah, I heard you're looking for somewhere to be when you get here. And I said, yes. And he said, well, my church is open to y'all. And I I was excited, and I was like, oh God, I gotta tell him that there's a bunch of queer and trans people coming, so we'll see if he's that excited. I said, thank you so much, Reverend Starsky. I just want to let you know, though, like, there's a bunch of queer and trans people are about to come to you, and if your church isn't into that, then we can't utilize your space. And he said, everybody is welcome here.
Yeah, that was a really powerful part of the book.
Oh my goodness, he changed us that weekend. That weekend changed us.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about your childhood, and I'm wondering if you'll read a few paragraphs. She does the reading of her book for the kind of audible version of the book, and I highly recommend it. You do such a beautiful job of reading it. But if
that was terrifying, by the way. They're like, so you're going to do an audiobook? I was like, I'm going to do it? They're like, yeah, it's your memoir. You should do it.
Yes. Well, you know, you make very clear in the book from the outset that some of your earliest memories are of the police. And so this particular memory, I think you said is one of your very earliest, where you're watching your young brother, who I guess is 11 or 12 at the time?
Yeah.
Why don't you set the scene? They're in the alleyway where they hang out to talk about girls. And
yeah, we lived in this a small apartment building. It was a 10-unit apartment building, mostly Section 8 housing, and no parks in the immediate.
Where were you living?
Van Nuys, California, a little suburb outside of the inner city of LA, a little working class suburb. And we had a front yard and an alleyway. And the alleyway was the place where our folks, young folks, and mostly the boys, spent a lot of time in. And it became one of the ground zeros for law enforcement to come, stop and frisk. And I was about 9. Monty, my older brother, is about 12, and my eldest brother is probably like 14, 15. No one was, it's interesting because as we wrote the book, I started to realize that we were all children, literally babies. And the interactions, those early interactions with law enforcement were so violent and so humiliating. And what it means to take the time as a police force to humiliate children and their community that they're living in is very purposeful.
all right, well, why don't you start here, actually, which is before. I was going to have you start so right there, all the way through.
The alleyway is where my brothers hang out with their friends and talk shit. That's okay to do it here, right? Like, probably about girls and all the things I probably never have done with them. Monty and Paul are 11 and 13 years old, and there are no green spaces, no community centers to shoot hoops in, no playgrounds with handball courts, no parks for children to build castles in, so they make the alleyway their secret place and go there to discuss the things they do not let me in on. I am the girl. 9 years old, I am the little sister banished behind the broken black wrought iron gate that tries but fails to protect us from the outside world. It's from behind that gate that I watch the police roll up on my brothers and their friends, not one of whom is over the age of 14, all of whom are doing absolutely nothing but talking. They throw them up on the wall, they make them pull their shirts up, they make them turn out their pockets, they roughly touch my brothers' bodies and even their privates, while from behind the gate I watch, frozen. I cannot cry or scream, I cannot breathe, and I cannot hear anything, not the siren that have been accompanying the swirl of red lights, not the screeching at the boys, "Get on the fucking wall." Later, I will be angry with myself. Why didn't I help them? And later, neither Paul nor Monty will say a word about what happened to them. They will not cry or cuss. They will not make loud, although empty threats. They will not discuss it with me, or who was a witness, or my mother, who was not. They will not be outraged. They will not say they do not deserve such treatment, because by the time they hit puberty, neither will my brothers have expected that things could be another way. They will be silent in the way we often hear of the silence of rape victims. They will be worried, maybe, that no one will believe them, worried that there's nothing that can be done to fix things, make things better. Whatever goes through their minds after being half-stripped in public and having their childhoods flung to the ground and ground into the concrete, we will never speak of this incident or the ones that will follow as Van Nuys becomes ground zero, and the war on drugs and the war on gangs, designations that had even more licensed police already empowered to do what they want to us. Now there are even more ways to make us the enemy, even more ways to make us disappear.
What was powerful about that telling was that we were able to see it through your eyes as a child. What that is, as to be helpless as a child, to watch your brother be humiliated, violated, abused, and to feel powerless, and how afterwards no one speaks of it. Anthropologists often talk about how it's the silences that speak the loudest in a culture. And you kind of analogize it to the silence of rape victims, which I think is really important. Paul Butler, in his book Chokehold, devotes a whole chapter to stop and frisk and describes stop and frisk not simply as brutality or excessive force in many cases, but as sexual violation.
Exactly.
And that we don't talk about in our culture the ways in which, especially black men, most commonly black men are subjected not just to excessive force, but what amounts to sexual violations and abuse. I remember when I was a civil rights lawyer back at the ACLU representing victims of racial profiling, Pastor Michael McBride, who you know, I think. He was very young. He was a youth pastor at the time. He had been stopped and brutalized by the police on his way home from actually leading a Bible study class. And I remember him sitting in my office and telling me, they sexually abused me. And there was a way in which I couldn't quite process that a stop and frisk, that a frisk was experienced as sexual violation. And now I understand that in a way that I didn't fully then. And I'm curious about whether you believe your brother Monty experienced these repeated assaults and violations in a way that may have broke him. You talk in the book about the way he, began to have episodes and became very seriously mentally ill and Do you believe that the experiences that he had on the street contributed to that, or do you feel that they're unrelated?
I think they're definitely related. I think, I said earlier, to be Black in this country is to experience serious trauma. And Monty, I think, has the most rational reaction to what has happened to him. And there's this way in which we as in the collective, we really, see Black people as strong, survivors. And while that is true, there's also that there's deep costs living in this country and living under this country for the last 6 centuries, what it's done to us. And I think, with Monty, while everybody in our community is in some ways, shape or form harassed or abused by the police, Monty is probably the most extreme case. And my brother was almost killed inside the LA County jails, which is also where he received his first diagnosis of mental illness. And while there were signs of mental health issues prior to his incarceration, it was exacerbated when he was incarcerated and amplified. And there is no treatment in jail for people who are mentally ill, and yet half of the people who are mentally ill are in jail, or half the population that's in jail is mentally ill. Yes. So there's this way in which we've created this really sick and disturbing cycle for poor people and Black people, and poor Black people in particular, where the only treatment, in quotes, where we can get some sort of aid is in containment, being caged.
Yes.
And that's no place for treatment.
No. You tell the story of how your brother, Monty, kind of wound up being charged with terrorism. And I wonder if you'll share that story with us here. It begins with his first arrest, and as you mentioned, he was diagnosed with mental illness. One of the things that leapt out to me in the telling was when he was home for the first time and having an episode. You called an ambulance for help, and what happened?
I did a number of things, one of which was waited because I had no idea what was happening. Because we don't, I think, thankfully for social media, we have much more transparent conversations about things, but this is not the height of social media. And our family maybe knew the word schizophrenic, knew the word bipolar, but we didn't understand what it actually meant for someone to live through it, let alone be a part of their lives while they're living through it. And so my brother was released when he was 23 years old after his first stint in prison, in the middle of a manic episode with no medication. He was released in a muscle shirt and his boxers and shower shoes.
Yes. He was put on
a Greyhound bus
in his underwear.
Yeah, by himself. And I remember being so excited. I hadn't seen my brother in years. I had barely talked to him. We had written back and forth. And while he alluded that he was inside the infirmary often, he said he was doing it for his own safety. So I didn't know what was happening really. And I went to go pick him up with a good friend of mine. All my friends had heard about my brother and I had talked about him and everybody was excited. And I pick him up and he looks like a shell of a human being. And I was like, something's going on. He hops in the front seat of the car and he's sort of hunched over, and I'm like, okay, well, he's been in prison, so maybe that, he just needs some adjustment time. And he walks in the house. My brother has a video camera on him, and his son is 3 years old at the time, jumps on him, and it was not the homecoming I thought it was going to be. And my mom pulls me aside, she says, something's wrong with my son. And I said, you're exaggerating. Just give it a couple days. And we did, and each day my brother deteriorated rapidly. And by day 3, we were locking ourselves in a room, petrified of the person who was in the living room, didn't know who he was. And I called 911 and I said, my brother just got out of prison. I should have never said that, literally. And they said, I'm sorry, ma'am. If he just got out of prison, you have to call the police. And I said, and I like broke down in tears. I was like, I can't call the police on him. Like, and I was, trying to tell them my brother was brutalized by the police. I can't call the police. And they're like, we can't help you. So.
Yeah, I mean, just pause right there. You have a family member who's mentally ill in the midst of an episode. Your entire family's in crisis, and you call for an ambulance, you call for health care, mental health treatment, and they say, call the police.
Literally.
Yeah.
So I went back and forth. I called a friend, and my mom is like literally in tears. I grew up, this is like 19 years of living. I'd never seen my mother cry before. This is the first time. Not only is she crying, she's hysterical. She's like lost it. And so I'm there and I'm trying to figure it out. And I call a friend and I said, I don't know what's happening to my brother. His partner at the time was studying psychiatry, and I tell her, she's like, it sounds like he's having a manic episode. It's the first time I get any sort of clarity about what could be happening. She's like, try to get him to a hospital. So we tried, that didn't work. So I called the police, and they send 2 rookie cops. And I go outside and I'm talking to the police about my brother, and I'm like, okay, so this is the situation. I'm trying to prep them and everything. And I could tell they're kind of scared. And I was like, this is not good for any of us. And I say, what are you going to do if my brother gets violent? And they said, oh, we'll just tase him. And I was like, you can't tase my brother. Like that's actually not, but literally they don't know what to do. So they come into my house, and my brother, it was a mess. My brother dropped to his knees and started crying, and I just knew it was like, this isn't gonna work. Like I'm not gonna, so I told them to leave. And we were left trying to figure out what to do. We did eventually get into a hospital, but it was the most traumatic experience ever. And it was one of those moments where I realized that they do not care about us. Like we really, we have the phrase, we all we got. It was that moment, I was like, we all we got. Like, and I sort of like reoriented myself, like I have to figure this out on my own. It's gonna be me and my family advocating for my brother's care basically for the rest of his life. And, years happen, and then I started DPN. That's an organization that ends up supporting people like Monty. But it was, that story still lives with me. And for years, it took us years, and my mom in particular years, to shake that, experience.
Yes. What becomes so clear in the telling is that your family was not just the collateral damage of the drug war, but was the targets of the drug war. You are living the consequences of us having kind of dismantled, mental institutions, often with the best of intentions, but having not yet developed any kind of ethic of care or concern for poor people, for people of color. And so our mental health treatment can be found mostly in prisons and jails to the extent it exists there at all. And you're just left to fend for yourselves. Say a little bit about how he wound up getting charged with terrorism and what happened when he was brought into the courtroom.
Yeah, well, I think, for folks who aren't familiar with the crisis around mental health care in this country, it's abysmal. And if you have a loved one, or if you have your own struggles with mental health, you know that it is forever. There's no cure. There's some medications that work maybe and often damage your organs. So Monty's been off and on his medication since he's 38 now, since he was 19 years old. And he got out of prison. We were all very excited. He probably went to the hospital twice in those 3 years. He was hospitalized twice. And then because of the criminalization of people, the continuous criminalization of people who are formerly incarcerated, my brother couldn't stay with my mother because my mother's has Section 8 housing. And in LA County, people who have a criminal record can't live with people who have Section 8 housing.
So he couldn't come home.
No, he was there for a couple months, but Section 8 made it really clear that he couldn't be there forever. So my brother ends up moving out, and he does need 24-hour care. He needs support. He can't take his medication on his own. Very quickly, he ended up in an episode. He drove his car, got into a car accident, got out the car. I wasn't there, so I don't know what happened. I know nobody was hurt physically, but what the woman whose car he hit said is that my brother cursed at her. She pressed charges. My brother was the second striker, and he was being charged with terrorist threats. And terrorist threats are a felony charge. And so that first court date that we went to go see him and see his charges, his public defender came out, also very new public defender. And I have a lot of love for public defenders. This is not a diss to public defenders. I know the job is hard. But this particular public defender was not a good public defender. And he came up to my mother and I, and he said, okay, looking at the chart, barely looking at us. So Monte Carlo, I see that his second strike. Okay, well, this would be his third strike, so he's looking at, life in prison. Just like that. And I said, okay, what's the plan to fight for him? That's probably not likely. He's second strike. Like, it was just matter of fact. And I said, okay, well, can you go let my brother know that we're going to hire another attorney? I didn't have the money. I was just like, this is not happening. I know that for sure. And he said, sure. He goes back there, tells my brother, and then he comes back and he says, your brother says it's okay. Your family doesn't have money. And I said, tell my brother we're hiring another attorney. He goes back there, tells him, comes back, and he says, okay, your brother says okay. So I spent the next 6 weeks, this is before Facebook or Twitter or anything, crowdfunding from people across the country to raise $10,000 to get my brother a private attorney. And we did. I think it was one of my first campaigns outside of my own, regular campaign work, first campaigns for my family. And we hired a private attorney. While my brother didn't get diverted, that's what he should have gotten. He should have been diverted to a mental health treatment, mental health courts. He was still criminalized. They struck the strike, and he ended up serving 8 years in prison, 85% time.
For yelling at the woman during a
Yep.
traffic. Yes. Am I remembering correctly that it was when he was charged with terrorism that time that he was wheeled into the courtroom strapped to a gurney?
Yeah, they don't do this anymore because I'm too scary now. So if my brother goes into jail, I just call the person that and let them know. But then I wasn't scary to them. And my partner reminded me, because we were talking about my brother, I was like, Monty's an anomaly. And my partner's like, no, Monty's not the anomaly, your family is. People don't get care unless they feel threatened. So at this particular instance, my brother was incarcerated in custody, and whenever he's in custody, we go visit him immediately because we want to make sure we're advocating on his behalf. So I went to the sergeant, and I said, my brother needs medication. Here's his medication. I gave him, we'll wait till he sees a psych doctor. Well, when's the psych doctor coming? Well, the psych doctor comes once a week. And so we don't have time. We really don't have time. He hasn't been on medication for months. He said, okay, well, don't worry about it. So I go see my brother, and I say, how are you doing? He's like, I'm not good. And if I don't get on my medication, it's not going to be good. He said, they keep giving me Advil. And so I go back downstairs, and I said, my brother says you're giving him Advil in place of his medication. He has psychotic episodes. You have to do something. they didn't treat my brother for weeks. Yet they took him to his court date, and probably one of the most compromised position I'd ever seen him in, both for himself but also for our family to witness, and his own mother and me as his sibling. And they wheeled him in a gurney. They had him in 5-point restraints, and they had a spit mask on him, and they wheeled him into the courtroom, and he was completely manic and psychotic. I mean, he wasn't there. He was yelling and screaming, and I remember the judge looking and saying, why is he here? Like she was confused, and but this is the madness of our system.
Yes.
Like the literal madness of our system. And so people who don't have mental health issues that are cycling in and out are vulnerable, but imagine people who have severe mental illness.
Absolutely. And, as you described, what he experienced while he was in jail would be enough to make anyone literally lose their mind.
Yeah.
And you came to realize years later that he was among the people who had experienced torture, literal torture in the LA County Jail. You just want to describe how you came to discover that? And then I'd love for you to just read a little bit about the charges that the ACLU brought against the jail.
Yeah, your old stomping grounds. So ACLU has been suing the Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles since the 70s, which is what I would come to find out after reading this particular civil rights complaint. They had never sued them on issues of excessive force. It was always issues of conditions.
Yeah.
And it's tricky, especially now that I've done a lot of work around police violence and use of force. The conversations of use of force are tricky, and because of the Police Officer Bill of Rights in the state of California, because of internal policies in the police department around use of force. But the ACLU has a jails project where they go and where people can call and say, I'm not getting my medication, or I've been brutalized. And they weren't planning on suing the Sheriff's Department around excessive force, but they started getting a particular amount of complaints that led them to this class action lawsuit. And I came across it in 2011. It was right after my brother came home the second time, and that was after the 6 years in prison for terrorist threats. We went and picked him up, and he came home in October. And in November, for whatever reasons, I happened to open up the ACLU email. I don't usually do that. But I did this time. I think I saw the sheriffs. It was like suing the sheriffs. I was like, what? They're getting sued? And I came across this 86-page complaint, and I think everybody should read it. It's a very, very powerful and terrifying and illuminating complaint that basically shared 70 sworn testimonies.
Yeah, you want to read a couple of
Yeah.
them? It's just saying that someone has been tortured doesn't quite capture the descriptions of what happened. You can read it, just a couple of them, starting there.
Yeah. And before I read this, it's important that we say torture.
Yes.
Because, one, this country doesn't torture people, they do, right, out there. But what I came to realize is that torture, there's a methodology around torture. It's systematic, it's on purpose. Abuse can be accidental, but torture is purposeful. And as I started to read each testimony and how much I realized, that's what happened to my brother. It became really important that we classified it what it is.
And these are the allegations.
Yeah. So, number one, deputies beat Mr. KK so violently that he suffered a fractured jaw and required eye surgery and stitches in his ear. The incident began after deputies searched all the cells on Mr. KK's row, and Mr. KK noticed that some of his property was missing, including items he had just purchased from the commissary. After asking to speak with the sergeant about the missing property, Mr. KK reported that a deputy shoved him hard against a wall, slapped his ear, punched his face several times, and threw him to the ground. With Mr. KK on the ground, the deputy kicked him roughly 10 times in the face, jaw, and back of his head, causing a large pool of Mr. KK's blood to form on the floor. The deputy then kicked Mr. KK's ear 3 times, an experience Mr. KK described as more painful than when he was hit by a car. 2, a men's central jail deputy attacked inmate Mr. JJ after Mr. JJ had said the deputy didn't have a date since high school. The deputy slammed Mr. JJ to the ground, and with another deputy searched Mr. JJ's property and threw his belongings in the toilet. The deputy stomped on Mr. JJ's hands with his boot, shattering his knuckle, and the deputies kicked Mr. JJ's body. The deputies used a taser on Mr. JJ, who suffers from epilepsy, and shot pepper spray into his face. Mr. JJ suffered extensive bruises and required surgery on the shattered knuckle in his hand. 3, deputies punched inmate Juan Pablo Reyes over and over again in the ribs, back, mouth, and eyes, breaking his eye socket and leaving his body badly bruised. When Reyes fell to the ground, deputies kicked him with their steel-toed boots, ignoring his cries. They did not stop there. The deputies ordered him to strip. They then forced him to walk naked up and down the hallway of a housing module in full view of other inmates. One deputy yelled, "Gay boy walking." As he walked, Reyes cried. The deputies laughed. They then placed him in a cell with inmates who beat and sexually assaulted him. The deputies ignored Mr. Reyes' repeated pleas to be taken out of the cell.
Yeah. So, what your brother experienced, he was largely silent about when he came home, found it difficult to communicate about his own experiences. And one of the recurring themes of your book is shame and silence, and how paralyzing it is for communities, and how difficult it is to get people to break the silence. I'm curious, kind of, what do you attribute kind of your willingness and your commitment to breaking silences in the way that you have? You mentioned that you wound up attending a social justice school where you got to read in high school Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin. And it was a school that created an environment that was safe enough for, I think you said 15 or 20 girls of color to be able to come out as queer. It was a place where it was okay to question and to critique. Do you think it was the opportunity to have access to a space like that that made it possible for you to interpret your own experience and find your own voice? Or do you perhaps attribute it to maybe your relationship with your father, Gabriel, and your experience attending AA meetings, which I thought was so powerful, the way you described what it was like to witness adults telling the truth about their own lives in a courageous way. I just wonder what you attribute kind of your willingness to name and break the silences about the abuse and the violence that's systemic around you.
I think it's a combination of all those things. I think it's part personality. I was the child who said too much often. So my mother would, before we'd walk out the house, my mom would say, "What are we not going to do?" And I'd be like, "Tell her all our business." I just didn't have a filter. I didn't understand things were private.
Yeah, I have a kid like that.
Exactly. So I had to, I learned my lesson many times, but it was processing out loud was important for me. And you just don't know what type of child you're gonna have. My mother is literally the opposite. I mean, opposite. I think silly things she'd hide from us, food, she'd be like, "That's my food, not yours." She'd have her own separate cabinet, that's her personality. And my personality was like, we share everything, we do everything. But then I think I was in environments that fostered it and gave space. And when I met my biological father at 11, he was very similar. And that family, I felt like, oh, that's who I'm like, you know, I'm like that. I'm very affectionate, I'm very talkative, I'm very curious. And I picked up a lot of those things from that side of the family. And then I got to, I was so blessed to go to this high school that I didn't actually want to go to. My mom didn't do the thing I wanted her to do, which was go to this other high school. So I landed in this high school because my principal was like, well, since your mom didn't put you in that one, do you want to go to this school? And I was like, whatever. Like, I'll just go. And I ended up getting, you know, an entryway to the movement. And first time I read Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, and the first time I read about Emma Goldman, and I came out in high school because it was an environment where I could, and I felt safe enough. And so this program really created this space, you know, for children to blossom and bloom. And then coupled with my own sort of righteous rage that I had growing up how I grew up, I think that was like a recipe for the making of an activist and organizer. You know, my father that raised me, not my biological father, but my father that raised me, used to always tell me when I was a kid, like, you're growing up in the wrong decade. You know, that was like 2-3 decades ago when they were doing that thing. And so he saw something early on, you know, inside of me. He's the one that taught me about the Black Power fist, and he told me all types of stuff that was so confusing. You know, one day he was ironing his pants, his 501 jeans with his starch. And he was like, Mommy, you know, Christopher Columbus was a colonizer. And I was like, what? I was so confused. And I was like, he's lying, you know? I remember going to my social justice high school. He probably told me that when I was 12. And the first class we had was learning about the truth about Christopher Columbus. And I was like, he was right. So I think there's like the children who, you know, there's a personality that wants to develop in a particular way. And I was that personality. And then I was luckily groomed and trained into an organizer.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about kind of your experience around kind of coming out and what that meant in terms of your family. And I know your mother's faith was one that was not open or welcoming, but do you feel like there's been a journey there in terms of your own family and within your community?
Still a journey.
Yeah.
I just had a whole other experience a couple days ago. Yeah, I mean, I came out at 15. My mother tells the story very differently than I do. You know, as I started doing more interviews telling my coming out story, she would call me and say, why are you telling people I kicked you out the house? I was like, because you did. She's like, no, I did not. So now I say I was pushed out my house. Makes her feel better. But because for her, she's like, a kicking out of the house means I physically I told you to leave. And what my mother told me one day is, I will not tolerate this in my house. And I was like, well, then I can't live here. You don't have room for me. And so I was houseless for a few years. Me and my best friend, we lived in cars, we lived in other people's homes. I had a teacher who brought us into her home. And she told me, you know, she said, I can't bring you in now because you're a student of mine, but the day you graduate, you all can come live with me. And trust and believe, the day I graduated, I got dressed at her house at for graduation. I was like, knock, 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 you said. And she was such a powerful, you know, other type of mother to me. Studied transcendental meditation, came from a very particular spiritual practice, and I just saw her the other day, and Donna just was a ground and a rock for myself and my best friend Carla, who ended up living with her. But the stories of young queer folks of color, you know, that's a common story, us being removed from our homes, houseless, and we don't all end up visible movement leaders.
Right.
Many of us end up committing suicide.
Yeah.
We end up homeless still. And so very, very blessed to have had mentors bring me in and hold me close at a time where some of the adults in my life couldn't do that for me.
Yeah. Did you feel accepted by your father?
Yeah, my father was in and out of prison, but my father was so chill. Part of the devastation of him passing, you all read about it in the book, was that I had felt like I finally found my like twin flame. And while my mother and I are very similar because she raised me, you know, so there's like a similarity in our energy, he was the person that was like, he sees me, you know, he sees me. And losing him was just the death of a parent is hard and painful, but it was also like I lost my best friend, like someone who sees me, an adult in my life that, you know, was very curious about my life and the work that I was doing. And also I felt like I saw him, you know, and he also had a way of bringing people together.
Yes, that's one of the things that comes through so well in the book is what it means to have an incarcerated parent, to have an incarcerated loved one, and how shattering it is for children, for young people, how it destroys, you know, hope, it destroys that sense of connection, but also what it did for the extended family that, you know, Gabriel was the one who brought everyone in the family together. He was the connective tissue for the family, and when he was gone, well, you can share the impact that was experienced.
Yeah, when he was gone, we all stopped connecting. Literally, you know, like it was, my father, the minute he would get out of prison, he would do a few things. There was a few first things he would do. He'd go move himself into a shelter because he never wanted to be a burden on the family. He would hustle to find a job. I don't know how. He's like one of the only formerly incarcerated people that always found a job. I was like, how do you do that? He would do telemarketing. I mean, and then he would set up a time for all of us to come together to eat gumbo at my grandma's house. Literally, you know, he'd be like, we'd get him a cell phone, he'd call all his siblings, he's one of 9, and we would all show up to my grandma's house. And it would be a ritual every weekend. We'd watch Sunday football. I still can't tell you anything about football. It's just a social thing. Everybody's like, how did you grow up with so much sports and you know nothing about them? But it was this ritual that he was the link to our ritual space. And when he was not there, the rituals dissipated.
Yes. I'm grateful that it seems like finally there's quite a bit of attention and advocacy focused on the experience of children who have incarcerated parents, women who have loved ones who are incarcerated, groups like SE Justice Group, and you know, others who are really shining a light on all those who are doing time on the outside, the trauma of having an incarcerated loved one, the economic burden when loved ones come home and are unable to support themselves, and just all of the fear and anxiety that goes along with having someone who has experienced trauma and isn't getting the support and help that they need. And that definitely comes through in the book. Well, we're running out of time, and so we're going to have to talk a little bit about BLM. And, you know, I know that you've told the story countless times of how BLM came to be, but if you could give a nutshell version for those who may not have heard it, that would be great. You know, how is it that Black Lives Matter was born? I know that you had already been doing a tremendous amount of organizing and advocacy through the Strategy Center. And, you know, much in the same way that people kind of imagine that Rosa Parks feet were tired one day, and so she, you know, didn't want to give up her seat, and boom, a movement happened. In fact, Rosa was a longtime organizer and activist. This hashtag didn't come out of nowhere. It came from women who had kind of a long history with organizing and activism. And if you could share the birth of BLM, that would be great.
It's like great mythology now. Three things happened. July 13th in 2013, George Zimmerman was acquitted of Trayvon Martin's murder. Alicia wrote Black Lives Matter on Facebook, and then I put a hashtag on it. And it happened organically. It happened from a deep place of passion and love and rage. And then Opal, a few days later, contacted Alicia and said, "Hey, I want to join this. I want to support whatever y'all need." And so the three of us created Black Lives Matter and really nurtured it for a whole year. Many people would know Black Lives Matter exists, but it would be our organizing around Black Lives Matter in our own movement circles first. Y'all have to remember, this is the height of Obama, when white people believed that we had our Black king and so we were saved. And there was no racism anymore. And so why do we even have to say the word Black?
Right. We have overcome.
We've overcome. And we have to have really direct conversations with ourselves and our movement and progressive folks around why Black Lives Matter is important, why specifying the kind of oppression Black people face was important. And then Ferguson happened.
Yeah, can you say a little bit about that? One of the things that I was struck by in reading was where you mentioned that you all were inspired to go to Ferguson, and you planned to bring a bunch of folks to Ferguson, but there was some people who didn't want y'all to come, that there was a wide diversity of opinion at that moment about whether folks should come or stay home. And I remember at that time receiving calls from people saying, you should come to Ferguson, and having very mixed feelings about it. I saw Jesse Jackson arrive and Al Sharpton arrive, and I worried about the kind of the sensationalism and the risk that this moment, this story that really belonged to the people of Ferguson, was going to be hijacked in some way. But on the other hand, there was such, a need for people to show up. And so I'm wondering about your decision. How did you kind of make the decision that, yes, we were going to go to Ferguson, even though perhaps some people, weren't happy with the idea of outsiders coming in?
Well, we asked a lot of people on the ground. And the word on the ground was "don't come." And then when we talked to people on the ground, the word was "don't come unless you have something to share with us." Because what a lot of people were doing was it was disaster tourism. Let's go watch this, let's go watch the tanks in Black communities. It wasn't a thoughtful, meaningful way to show up on the ground. And so we were given very specific instructions. If you're going to come, here's what you're going to bring. You're going to bring medics, because people are being rubber bulleted and pepper sprayed and traumatized. So you're going to bring medics and healing justice practitioners. You're going to bring youth organizers, because a lot of young people in the streets. It was there was not a lot of older folks. There was mostly like 35 and under in the streets, and women and their kids. So youth organizers, we want lawyers. They made a request for Black journalists. They were tired of the way in which CNN and MSNBC was talking about them. So they asked for Black journalists, people like Brittany Cooper and Jamila Lamu, Akiva Solomon. And they asked for folks that do policy work. So we gathered those people, and we put a call out on social media and said, here's the skills that they want. If you have those skills, send us your resume, tell us what you do. And we vetted. And then we raised money in like 5 days or something crazy like that. Some foundations did come through, mostly individual donors. And we took buses to Ferguson. And it was, we called it the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride. Darnell Moore and I helped organize it with dozens of folks across the country. And we had about 18 cities, including Toronto, Canada. And we had there was two things that we wanted to do, one of which was make sure the people in Ferguson knew that we were there for them. We had their backs. And then we all wanted to go back home and organize. And that really is the birth of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, our chapter-based network. And 18 cities went back home, and we geared up for whether it was going to be the non-indictment of Darren Wilson or the indictment of Darren Wilson. And that is probably one of the first times BLM goes viral, when Darren Wilson's not indicted.
In the book, you talk about the fact that there were goals for Black Lives Matter from the very beginning. Kind of in the media, there was this narrative that, there's this kind of movement kicking off, or this network being formed, and kind of where are the goals? What do they want? And you made clear that there were goals from the beginning that were stated and that, weren't a secret to anyone. And eventually, there was the Movement for Black Lives platform that isn't mentioned in the book. And so I was curious about that, kind of what the relationship was of BLM to the Movement Black Lives platform. And
well, we helped create the Movement for Black Lives, and the platform was created by the policy table in the Movement for Black Lives. BLM Network is an organization that's a part of the 50 organization coalition across the country, Black-led orgs. And part of the Movement for Black Lives policy table and pamphlet was to well, first it was, there's lots of people doing work already. So if you see the authorship of the platform, there's multiple authors of it, because we were really clear, our movement is leaderful. We don't follow one charismatic leader. We don't see ourselves as leaderless. That's obnoxious. There's lots of leaders. It's okay to be a leader. And that we also were really clear that there's people doing powerful work, and we wanted them to author certain sections of it. It's unfortunate that folks, both elected officials, influencers sometimes too, and sometimes people on the ground, had this sort of idea that Black Lives Matter didn't know what it was doing, or that we had, that protest isn't going to lead to everything, and that we didn't understand strategy. And I think part of the book was also really, that section was really shaping, like, we are strategists. Many of us have been doing this for a long time. We're thoughtful, we're thinking about this. And I think while in this moment, we're in a really ripe time to create and shape the political process, I think the last 4 years, it was about being in the streets. And part of what liberal governments do often is try to co-opt your movement by being like, come in these closed doors and come talk to us, we'll give you what you want. And we were like, no, we've been talking to you, and you haven't given us what we want, so we're gonna stay in the streets. And I think many countries know that. And sometimes this...
And the media understands it when it's happening in another country,
exactly.
why people are in the streets and why they're not going home and why it's necessary for them to be there, but it's often treated more as a curiosity or mystery when it's happening at home.
Completely.
So what would you describe as the main lessons learned? I mean, I guess...
So many lessons.
If I want the next book, I want the sequel. People are always telling me what my next book should be about. So I would love to hear, though, what, now as you're looking back, it's been quite a ride. And, what would you describe as some of the main kind of lessons learned from the experience you've had so far? There's one point in the book where you talk about the Netroots conference, and, where you and others kind of like bum rushed the Netroots conference with Bernie Sanders on the stage, and you say that you wouldn't do it the same way, that you have some regrets about how that was handled, but you don't actually say what your regrets were. And so I'm kind of curious, about that.
I would bum rush the stage again, for sure, so that's not the regret. Part of when we did that action, we were all grieving around Sandra Bland. That action was to lift up Sandra Bland in particular. We had felt like there wasn't enough actions for Black women who had been killed by the police, and thought it was a perfect opportunity. Angela Peoples, who's the former co-director of Get Equal, actually had the idea. She's like, hey, there's going to be a presidential forum here. We should shut it down. And we were like, yes! But because at that point, in some ways, we were not used to what it meant to be visible. we didn't really call anybody to be like, hey, we're going to shut this forum down. So I remember us shutting it down, and then it obviously got lots of media attention, and I was very surprised. I was like, oh. And a good friend of mine called me, this comms person. He said, how come you did not tell me you were going to bum rush the stage? And I was like, I didn't know. So I think in some ways, lessons learned, I've learned so much. A big lesson would be around security. We didn't get the privilege of learning directly from like the Panthers. You know, I think there's just like one generation above us who worked directly with the Panthers, a lot of them as political prisoners, and were schooled very early, like, y'all watch your backs. And I think we didn't understand that. And, you know, I think our generation is a very like, the healing justice stuff is like leads, right? And like, when we start talking about security, people are like, wait a second, like, that's too closed.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize how quickly that we would be labeled as terrorists.
Yeah.
That would be leveraged against us. I remember hearing it for the first time, and I was like, shit, they're like coming after us.
Yeah. Towards the end of the book, you have SWAT teams come into your home, and you know, you realize what the stakes are, what the risks are for activists today. So do you think that's one of the main lessons?
It's
that
a
you
big
would
lesson
say?
because
You know,
it impacts how you grow a movement. It impacts who you bring in. It impacts what things you talk about publicly, what you don't. It impacts strategy.
Yeah.
Of not having or not having a strong security plan. And it scares people. It's demoralizing and debilitating, getting death threats and not knowing how to take care of people. We don't call the police.
Right.
So what do you do?
Right.
And, you know, I remember the first time I received death threats that were serious enough for me to consider having security with me, and I ended up getting the NOI. A security good friend said, you know, I have the NOI security, I think you should use them. And the NOI was amazing, the fruit was amazing, and I was like, I had never felt so safe in my life. I was like, this is how white people feel on a daily basis. But I also was like, we don't have this. We don't have this infrastructure around security in our generation. And we're working on it now, cybersecurity and physical security, but sometimes it feels like they, as in the other side, moves way faster than we can keep up with.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of people. We've lost a lot of people from, you know, we have our own political prisoners. This generation, there's been a significant...
And that's been something that's received almost no media attention. There's people still in jail today because of Ferguson activism.
Exactly.
Yes.
People still fighting charges, people on probation. Lots of our folks have committed suicide.
Yes.
We've had a lot of people lose
And then
their
people
lives.
like Erica Garner,
who died of the maternal mortality crisis here.
Yes.
And the three people in Ferguson who've all died pretty much in the same way.
Yes.
You know? So there's a lot of inside of our own circles, a lot of grief and death and burnout, to be frank. And I think there's ways that when you're gearing up, you can't stop an uprising, but there's ways that you could gear up for one.
Yeah, you know, there was a New York Times article recently about the trauma of activism and the depression associated with it, and the necessity of more kind of self-care, for lack of a better word. And is that something that you have found a way to do in your own life? Is that part of your spiritual practice? Is caring for yourself in a way that helps to ensure that our movements are sustainable?
I do all the things, and I think, you know, my big thing right now that I'm advocating for at every single place I go to is when Black folks get a reparations package, we should have a therapist. We should have our own personal therapist as part of our reparations package. We don't have the infrastructure to actually do the care that we need to.
Yeah.
I choose not to use the word self-care. I like to think about it as collective care.
Yes.
This expectation for us to go and take care of ourselves after the state has brutalized us, humiliated us.
But is it infrastructure that we need?
I think it's a lot of different
Yeah.
things. I think it's infrastructure. I think it's a continued awareness around when you live in a culture that denies you everything. It also means that you don't know your own needs. So I had to learn for years to name what I needed. That's a skill set. People of privilege, white folks in particular, men, they know how to name their needs because that's built in the infrastructure of their well-being. You demand this thing for yourself. You make sure that you have this. That's not.
There's just part of me who can't help think that ought to be the role of spiritual communities, of faith communities,
Yeah.
right? Of, showing up to be able to
And being
support
present.
one another, that collective care, that collective love and caring for one another as we process our trauma and our grief, and as we build strength to go back out into the world. I think
that's right. I think that's right.
If our spiritual and faith communities aren't doing that, then, in what good are they?
What role do they
Yes,
play?
yes.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think in some places that's true for folks. So much of our folks who are leading our movement are queer and trans are not necessarily in faith communities that have infrastructure. We're sort of hodgepodging our way through. So we make our own community. We call it chosen family. So I think there are amazing groups out there that are doing that healing justice is a part of the work that they do inside their organization. And I'm really pushing for that, and our movement is that we center healing justice as part of how we do our work.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Well, I've gone over time, and I can keep going. She's like, wrap up. So I want to thank you, and I want to have some time for Q&A. But before I do Q&A, I really want to just pose one question to Asha. Surprise, she doesn't know I'm doing this. But as the co-author, I think of you really as a midwife for the story, making it possible for this story, for your journey, for your truth to be born and told in the world. And it seems that we all need to find ways to be midwives to one another's stories, to help one another tell their truths, to share their experience. And I hope you'll just say a few words about why you said, yes, I got this right away. What did it mean to you to partner with Patrice in the telling of this story?
Well, first, is the mic off?
Yes, just stand up. Once you go over here, and just stand up.
I'm no makeup. I'm going to stand right over here.
I should have warned you, Asha.
Let me just say what a beautiful conversation that was. As much as I know your story, to hear parts, just very overwhelmed right now, as much as I know it. I'm a reporter by training, and I know what it. Okay, so I'm a reporter by training, and trained under the great Susan Taylor at Essence Magazine, who gave so much voice to people who had never had a place. She used to read it's just freaking me out. I'll hold it. It's okay. So I learned from her the importance of ensuring that people had voice, right? So I want to just say that and acknowledge where I got a lot of my training from. The real answer is that you never have a choice with Patrice. She pushy like a... And so Patrice and I had worked together, and there's just a couple of things, that I want to share. I want to say it was important to me that Patrice got paid. What she doesn't say in this story is that she worked for years as an organizer and never got paid. And so I knew how to get paid. And that was really important to me, to not just have her story told. The other thing was that people were lying. And there's nothing more offensive to me than misnaming, lying about Black people's history. And so I remember back some years ago, right post Ferguson, and other people were being named as the founders of Black Lives Matter, and they were men. And it wasn't true. Ray didn't do it. Some of the stories that I've heard about him since from young Black women would make you cringe and wither, and Patrice won't tell you that, but I will, because I'm a reporter. And it was really important to have the truth told. So many lies have been told about us, and Patrice was working day in and day out. And I don't know how to do a lot of things. I know how to raise a girl and get her to be the only student in her class to ED into Columbia University. Name that. Name that. Even though she was called stupid by white kids who didn't ED into their schools that weren't Ivy League, but that said. And I know how to write. I know how to write a book and do a process. And I just felt like, you deserved a partner, right? Because it's like what you were saying, Patrice, about, oh, go take care of yourself, go take care of yourself. But there's no tools. Or there's no time because you're being like under assault all the time. We deserve partners, and we deserve people who, when we say, I believe in you, actually show up and really believe in you. And so if I did that, to any extent, I tell you I did it the best I could, and it's just been an honor to work with you.
Well, I know there's some other folks here who have questions, so please take the mic.
Hello. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing tonight, and I look forward to reading your book. My name is Danielle, and I am a first-year MDiv here at Union, and I came from Pico. I worked in Sacramento, working with my comrade Tanya Faison.
Oh, yay.
Yes. So the question that I have is, what have been the triumphs and the challenges in working with faith and spiritual leaders and congregations in fighting state-sanctioned violence?
It's great. Well, I don't know if you've seen, there's a video going around today, a pastor in Los Angeles, actually, so I gotta go find him, talking a lot of mess about Black Lives Matter. And I think there's this way, can you all hear me? Hello? I think there's this way that there's a lot of good faith leaders out there that aren't being lifted up for their work. And so the ones that are saying like really terrible things end up being the ones that go viral. And it really impacts, I think, how movement wants to relate to those faith leaders. I think there's also some really important work happening. Pastor Blackman out of St. Louis, Reverend Starsky, were really important. Pastor McBride is really important. There's younger pastors that also don't feel like are being seen in their work. We have a youth, he's not a youth pastor, he's a pastor, but Pastor Eddie, he's just young in Los Angeles, who's literally probably like the only pastor. A lot of pastors turned their back on us in Los Angeles when Black pastors decided to side with our mayor, even though Black community was saying no. Our mayor had done nothing to support victims of police violence, and so a bunch of Black pastors, it has everything to do with power, money, went on his side. And so there was a big break, and this Pastor Eddie, has stuck by our side. So I think there's, in any space, there's people who are doing great work and people who are not. And I think what's important is that we are able to be nuanced. I think faith leaders and the work of faith institutions are incredibly important right now, and we should be in coalition together. And then I would just push and challenge us to also be working with the non-Abrahamic tradition folks. When we say faith leaders, we often think of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And I think there's a lot of practitioners out there that would come out the closet if they knew that they would be embraced. And they have a lot of followers and people that are of that faith that also would want to be a part of this larger faith conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Patrice, my name is Claudio Carvalhais. I teach liturgy and ritual here. And one of the things that I do is to actually try to learn what the Black Lives Matter do in terms of its rituals of resistance and transformation to actually engage with it here. Coming from Brazil, I love to know that you are the IFA, and so it's such an important presence of the Axé in Brazil to sustain so many people and Black people there. And I hope you do know how much you bless us. And I hope that you will hear it at nauseam, that you are blessing us in so many ways. I hope you always hear that. And your book is such a demonstration of that. Right at the beginning, we can see the expansiveness of your Axé, just by the way you describe your mother, especially your father, and how you start by reminding us that we are all results of the stardust. And so that was, I think that helps us to understand the mutuality of the work of that you do. And if you could respond quickly to two questions. One is I'm since hearing your and reading your strong spiritual life, I have a sense that at the beginning, at least, the Black Lives Matter didn't want anything to do with the religion. It was kind of preventing, and I want to know why. Is that because it was because the civil rights movement was so drenched by religion? Was it because of afraid of being kidnapped by it? Or I'd love to know, and if it has changed, because you have said so much of the participation and importance of religion, if that is true, that it has changed, and if I'm right to say that the religion was not so much something allowed, and in what ways you see it moving and happening now. And the second thing is how quickly and how we other people can engage, and what are the rules, like from brown people to engage, because we are in this share of garment of mutuality. How can we engage together in this work?
Yeah. Well, I think the first question is an interesting one. I don't know if we were against religion. I know that I think many of us in Black Lives Matter, especially folks who are queer and trans, were kicked out of our traditions, or kicked out of our churches, and we're not. So we created our own church. And create our own set of rituals. So I think that's partly what has happened. And I think that faith leaders have had to really deal with us in ways that they maybe weren't expecting to. I've had some very courageous conversations with faith leaders, particularly around gender and transgender, and having courageous conversations around, are you creating a safe place for trans people in your church? And maybe the church has had its own evolution around queer people, but trans people is different. And so there's this way in which we've had to do a back and forth. And yeah, it's been a process. It's been a process. There's lots of space, I think, for folks, for non-Black folks to engage with Black Lives Matter. I think there's a lot of different examples of that have happened across the country. I remember one of the actions that happened, I think it was POC folks for Black Lives in the Bay Area, where they shut down the street and shut down one of the Oakland Police Department precincts. And Oakland Police Department wasn't able to get into their own precinct. It was such a brilliant action. And it was actually a challenge to, because there was lots of Black folks doing civil direct action, civil disobedience, being arrested, and it was POC folks putting their bodies on the line for Black lives and showing up in this particular way. And there's been a lot of creative and innovative ways. And I think there's this larger conversation that has been happening since the upsurge of BLM, which is around people of color, non-Black POC people having courageous conversations about anti-Black racism and what that looks like and how that has shaped many of our folks. I see the wrap up. I get nervous about those, so I'm like, I'll shut up. Welcome.
Do we have a couple more? Time for a couple more? Okay, I see there's two right there.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Kiana. I am a second year MDiv student here. I am actually from Ferguson, and I'm so glad that you asked the question about how Patrice, how they felt coming, knowing that some people came to Ferguson to, take photos and be a part and to lead. And even just hearing you talk about it, the traumatic feeling is coming back again. It's almost like PTSD where, my high school is a block from the police station. Just seeing it on television and being there physically, but like this notion of strategy that you said you guys came in mind to bring something. And I thought, to me, that just really touched me because even some people who lived in Ferguson, pastors, not all, some people who lived there kind of used it as a gimmick to call camera crews to show up so they can look like they're doing something. And I just literally listened to you talk about how you brought journalists and lawyers and all of that. And as a young woman myself who is very passionate about police brutality, who is looking to intern and to learn, but this notion of you weren't only just involved in community engagement, but operations and project planning, and really that takes a lot of strategy and a lot of expertise. And someone like me, I don't know where to begin or where to start to even gain that insight or that knowledge. I want to do so much. I'm here because of Ferguson. I'm here because I lived it. I'm here because I was almost thrown into a cop car by Ferguson police on my high school grounds. Like, I'm here because of all of that. So, and I know not one place can be the source of everything. So I'm just curious as to where to even begin.
Yeah.
And how to keep on as far as the strategy piece.
Yeah.
That's such an important question.
Yeah. Well, my big thing is join an organization. If your focus is on, there's a lot of amazing people here in New York that you could sit and talk with, but there's nothing like being in it. And being a part of something that is doing the thing that you feel most passionate about. And I remember the first organization I joined, I was 18 years old. They came to one of the youth programs I was at, and they brought, this youth program brought 4 organizations. One of them was the library. Library's cool, but I was not that interested in interning at a library. But then there's this other crew of folks that were organizers. I didn't know. Hello? I didn't know the term organizer at the time, but they were talking about racism explicitly. They were talking about, trying to fight for some things. Went inside the room. They showed this little video. It was so cool. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I remember going up to them, and the first thing I asked was do you take on the police? They're like, no, we don't. And I was like, it's okay, I'll join anyways. I was so thirsty to be somewhere that was taking on local government. And it took about 6 years. I was there for 11 years. In the first 6 years, I did environmental justice work. that I loved, and it was really important to me. And then we made a decision as an organization to start taking on the local school police. And I was like, oh, that's the work that I want to be doing. So I think for you, it's about finding what is it you want to do, and finding the organization that's local to you, and showing up and volunteering and supporting. And those, being in the field is like where you get and where you learn what you want and how you want to be a part of it. I'm an organizer, but I do a lot of other things, and I realized, I love fundraising. It's a big part of the work that I do. Who would have thought, right? There's very few people. I know Asha loves fundraising. Like, I love taking people's money and giving it to the people who deserve it. Like, there's nothing more satisfying. In this work, we kind of use the word organizer, but organizer means so many things. In this work, there's we need everybody. Everybody needs to join this. And my entryway, I'm not a fan of being your own individual activist. There's no accountability in that. I'm a fan of people joining something. Maybe I'm old school like that, but everybody joins something. And as you join something, being able to be a part of a collective and a community of people that we all have our eyes on the prize is so powerful.
Your question, as well as the answer, reminds me of an experience that I had shortly after my book came out, and I started traveling all over the country speaking to people about the crisis of mass incarceration. And at the end of my speeches, inevitably during the Q&A period, people would say, well, what can I do? What can I do? I don't have the tools. I don't have the ability. I want to be part of the movement. I want to fight back. I want to be part of this, but what can I do? And in a city like New York, I think it's easy to say, well, there's a plethora of organizations you can join. Just kind of figure out what your interests are and find an organization that's doing something related to it. But I would say for the overwhelming majority of communities out there across the country, there isn't an organization that you can just join and now you're part of the movement.
Yeah, especially that's taking on the police.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and it's a striking contrast to, for example, during the peak of the civil rights movement, where there were grassroots membership-based organizations in maybe the majority of the states. Yeah. You could join SNCC, you could join SCLC through the various network of churches. There was CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. There was the NAACP. These were all membership-based organizations. So if you wanted to join the movement, you could join the movement and get trained to be an organizer and an activist in the movement. And today, when people say, I want to join the movement to end mass incarceration or to challenge police violence or whatever, people are at a loss. And there isn't the same kind of infrastructure that exists, kind of an on-ramp for folks to be able to join and get the training and support and accountability they need to participate effectively. And it seems to me that part of what the Black Lives Matter Network was attempting to do was to kind of provide sort of an on-ramp for people in communities around the country. But it seems like we're a long way away from having the kind of infrastructure that existed to kind of take on the old Jim Crow to tackle the phenomenon of police violence and mass criminalization, mass deportation, all of it that exists today.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think for Black Lives Matter, at the end, I know that because there's such a hunger and thirst for Black Lives Matter. There's a hunger and thirst for some sort of place for people to go to do that.
Yeah.
I still say join the organization.
Yeah.
Even with all that, go to what is best right now as we're figuring out what we need to do.
Yeah. All right, one last question. You got it.
Good evening. My name is Hassan. I'm a second-year MDiv student here at Union also. Thank you for sharing, and particularly sharing the story of your brother, which was compelling for me, and took my mind to thinking about a particular kind of mental health industrial complex and the cooperative function between policing in prisons and psych wards, the connections between nurses and lieutenants and psych doctors and wards. And so I'm asking if you could to kind of think about, I'm thinking about like where your brother is now, and how, if at all, the state has served him by way of like remedy in hospitals, remedy in the ward. In my own experience, there has been none with my family, and in many ways, I'm recalling your mentioning that there were no services in prison for those who were living with mental illness, and I have also seen family members be released from the ward, be released from the hospital, still very manic, and in many ways worse than they went in from the violences that they had experienced by way of doctors and nurses and other patients. Mm-hmm. And so if you could speak to that and where it is, how it is that you see we might be able to respond or remedy or help our own people who are not being helped by this mental health industrial complex, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, part of the disturbing part of this country is that the medical industry is built off of anti-Black racism. It's built off of experimenting off of our bodies and our ancestors' bodies, and so when you have a history like that, it means the present is relating to the history. I don't have an answer to how we deal with severe mental illness. I know that with my brother, we've created part of the experiment of a Dignity and Power Now, my local org, or Black Lives Matter, is creating the community that can take care of the people who need the care the most. And while I would never not take my brother to the hospital, because I prefer a prison over a hospital, and my family and
hospital over a prison.
I prefer a hospital over prison. Thank you for the record. It's late, and I've been up since 4 a.m. We have enough in place as a community that can care for him on his way there and make sure we care for him on his way out. It's harm reduction. That's the model that we live in right now for Black people. Until we have institutions ran by us that are for us, by us, taking care of us, we have the institutions that we have. In LA, I know which institutions not to take him to. I won't take him to that hospital because I know what that hospital does. I know what that doctor does, that nurse does. So I know this doctor and this nurse. I'm going to advocate for him to go this place. It's not the long-term solution, but I think it's important that we have harm reduction solutions now. I have attempted I have tried to care for my brother outside of a hospital setting, and I failed miserably. It wasn't good for him, and it wasn't good for me. And he ended up in the hospital anyways, way worse than if we had early intervention, because I had I know what they do. I know that they strap him down. I know that they see a big Black man and they're scared of him. And so I attempted to not take him to a hospital, and it was not good. So I learned how to advocate better and stronger. And I think we have to do that for each other, as Black people in particular. I think we need to learn how to build community with one another and our own organizing work, but also in our own personal world, because oftentimes what we're fighting for in our work is because we're also fighting for it in our personal lives. And it becomes incredibly important that the skills that I build in my organizing work, I use it in my family, and the skills that I use in my family, I use in my organizing work.
Yeah, one of the most powerful scenes in the book is when your kind of extended family, your self-made family, comes together to help your brother through an episode and drives him to the hospital and sits there in the car for an hour, slowly, steadily coaching him out of the car, and what it took for, you know, your self-made family to come together and support. In that way, it was so powerful that this is what it means to build community and to do what we can to survive in this time. And I just want to thank you so much for your voice, for your work, and for being here. It's been phenomenal. Thank you. You're wonderful.
Yeah.
You got that.
Where do we go this way?
We can go out, or you can.